The Galactic Empire prided itself on its dominance, spanning countless star systems, its iron grip unchallenged by any of the scattered civilizations that dared to rise against it. The arrogance of its officers was as vast as its borders, a certainty rooted in millennia of conquest. When the patrol ship Vigilance captured a lone human wandering too close to an Imperial outpost, the crew treated it as little more than a routine operation, a petty nuisance at best. The human had been found unarmed, his appearance unimposing. He wore simple, nondescript clothing, his face calm, almost bored, as the Imperial soldiers barked orders. It was as though he was utterly indifferent to the rifles aimed at his head. Commander Thrax, the officer in charge of the patrol, had found the entire affair amusing. Another one of Earth's brave champions, Thrax sneered, his towering form looming over the prisoner. His chitinous armor glinted under the harsh lights of the interrogation chamber. The human, bound to a metal chair with restraints designed for far stronger species, didn't flinch. "What's your name, human?" Thrax asked, circling him like a predator, sizing up its prey. The man raised his head, his green eyes meeting Thrax's cold, alien gaze. "Jake Sullivan," he said evenly, his voice devoid of fear or defiance. Thrax leaned closer, his mandibles clicking faintly. "You should know that your planet is inconsequential. Primitive. Weak. You should feel honored we even bother with this exercise." Jake's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "If you say so." Thrax's amusement faltered, irritation flashing across his face. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. Most prisoners, especially humans, broke quickly under the weight of Imperial authority. Yet this one sat there, unyielding, as though the chains binding him were little more than a minor inconvenience. "You were spotted near one of our secure outposts," Thrax continued, his voice sharp now. "What were you doing there? Spying for your so-called militaries?" Jake tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "Taking a walk." The silence that followed was suffocating. Thrax's subordinates, standing stiffly along the chamber's walls, exchanged uneasy glances. The human's casual defiance was unsettling, though none of them dared voice it aloud. Thrax slammed a clawed hand onto the table, the metal groaning under the force. "You are testing my patience, human." Jake didn't flinch. If anything, his smile widened ever so slightly. "I didn't realize I needed to worry about that." The interrogator hissed, his mandibles flaring in irritation. "You think this is a game?" Jake's gaze sharpened, the faint amusement in his expression replaced by something colder, harder. "Not a game. Just not as serious as you think it is." Thrax straightened, his claws clicking against the floor as he turned away, regaining his composure. "You're a fool, human. Do you know what happens to those who defy the Empire?" Jake leaned back in the chair, the restraints creaking slightly. "I've got a pretty good idea." Thrax turned back to him, his voice dripping with menace. "Your species clings to a fragile world, surrounded by powers far greater than you can comprehend. You are insects scurrying about pretending to be significant, and now you've dared to trespass into the Empire's domain." Jake said nothing, but his silence wasn't submissive. It was the kind of silence that filled a room before a storm. His eyes remained locked on Thrax, unblinking, as if he were the one studying his captor, not the other way around. Thrax stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Tell me, Sullivan, do you know fear?" Jake's response was immediate, his voice low but steady. "I've met it, but we're not on speaking terms anymore." The alien officer's claws flexed, his temper fraying. He loomed over Jake, his voice rising. "You think yourself clever, but cleverness will not save you. I will extract what I need from you, one way or another. And when I do, you'll wish you'd answer me willingly." For the first time, Jake's smile faded entirely. His expression became unreadable, his gaze steady and unyielding. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "You're making a mistake." Thrax barked out a harsh laugh. "Oh, and what mistake is that?" Jake leaned forward as much as the restraints allowed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think I'm your prisoner?" The room fell silent. Thrax stared at him, the alien's confidence faltering for the briefest of moments. But the moment passed, and Thrax sneered. Empty bravado. Pathetic. He motioned to his subordinates. Take him back to his cell. Let him rot until he's ready to talk. The guards moved to obey, hauling Jake to his feet. He didn't resist, allowing himself to be led from the chamber. Yet as he passed Thrax, he glanced over his shoulder, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. You won't like what happens next. Thrax dismissed the comment with a wave, but as the human was dragged away, an uneasy weight settled over the chamber. Alone in his cell, Jake sat in the dim light, his hands now free from the shackles thanks to the small, improvised tool he'd hidden in the cuff of his sleeve. He rubbed his wrists absently, his mind racing. Every second he'd spent in the interrogation chamber had been a calculated move. He'd studied Thrax, noting his arrogance, his overconfidence. He'd memorized the layout of the ship, the guard rotations, even the slight delay in the automated security systems. The Galactic Empire might have captured him, but they had no idea what they were dealing with. Jake Sullivan wasn't just a human soldier. He was a Navy SEAL, a predator in human skin, trained to survive, adapt, and dominate in situations far worse than this. As he began to formulate his next move, a faint smile returned to his face. They thought they'd captured a helpless primitive. They were wrong. The dim hum of the Imperial cruiser's engines filled the silence of the cell block. Jake Sullivan sat on the edge of the hard cot, his fingers tracing the seams of his pants, though his mind was far from idle. Every detail he'd observed since his capture had been cataloged. The layout of the corridors, the number of guards, the timing of patrols, and the flicker in the camera feed that suggested a blind spot. His training demanded precision, and he had no intention of failing. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and soundless. In his hand, the small improvised pick he'd hidden from the guards caught the faint light. They hadn't searched him thoroughly, another mark of their arrogance. Jake knelt by the cell's control panel, his eyes narrowing as he examined the mechanism. Imperial technology was sleek but over-engineered, reliant on the assumption that no one would have the knowledge or daring to tamper with it. The lock gave a soft hiss, and the cell door slid open. Jake waited, his pulse steady as he listened for any reaction. Nothing. The guards trusted their systems too much, another critical mistake. He slipped into the hallway, his movements fluid, his presence like a shadow. Ahead, two guards stood at the end of the corridor, their backs turned. The alien soldiers were tall and broad, their thick exoskeletons gleaming under the sterile lights. Jake moved with predatory grace, closing the distance in silence. When he struck, it was with the speed and precision of a viper. The first guard didn't even have time to register the knife, slicing through the sensitive joint at the base of his skull. Jake spun toward the second, using the body of the first as a shield against the inevitable energy blast. The second guard stumbled back, fumbling with his weapon, but Jake was faster. He drove the blade into the alien's throat, silencing him with a brutal efficiency that left no room for error. He lowered the bodies gently to the ground, pausing only long enough to strip one of its sidearm and communicator. Every action was calculated, every second accounted for. Jake was no longer the quiet prisoner enduring an interrogation. He was a predator unleashed. Moving deeper into the ship, Jake avoided unnecessary confrontations, slipping past patrols and security checkpoints with a blend of luck and skill. The cruiser was vast, its labyrinthine corridors a potential death trap for anyone unfamiliar with its layout. But Jake had already committed much of it to memory, mapping his escape route with the precision of a seasoned operative. Reaching the engineering deck, he found what he was looking for: the ship's power systems. The room was vast, filled with towering consoles and pulsing conduits that radiated a faint, eerie glow. Jake moved swiftly, planting the small explosives he'd constructed from scavenged materials during his time in the cell. They weren't elegant, but they didn't need to be. A distraction was all he required. The first explosion rocked the ship, sending a shudder through its metallic skeleton. Alarms blared, and the corridors flooded with the sound of rushing boots as the crew scrambled to contain the damage. Jake slipped into the chaos, using the confusion to his advantage. He was invisible amidst the panic, a specter moving against the tide. Near the bridge, a squad of heavily armed guards blocked his path. Jake ducked into a side corridor, assessing his options. Direct confrontation was risky, but he couldn't afford a detour. He drew a deep breath, steadying himself, and then launched his attack. The first guard went down before the others realized they were under assault. Jake moved like a whirlwind, his stolen weapon barking energy bolts with lethal precision. The squad's return fire was wild, their panic evident as they faced an enemy who moved faster than they could track. In less than a minute, it was over, the corridor littered with the bodies of the fallen. Jake leaned against the wall, his breath coming in controlled bursts. His left arm burned where a glancing shot had seared through his jacket, but he ignored it. Pain was irrelevant, a distant sensation that would only distract him from his objective. He breached the bridge moments later, his weapon trained on the crew before they could react. The officers froze, their hands raised as Jake's voice cut through the air like a blade. Step away from the controls. Now! The captain, a gaunt alien with pale, scaled skin, hesitated, his gaze flicking toward a console. Jake fired a warning shot, the energy bolt scorching the metal inches from the captain's hand. "I won't ask twice." The crew obeyed, their movements slow and deliberate. Jake approached the central console, his eyes scanning the displays. The Empire's technology was advanced, but he was no stranger to adapting under pressure. His fingers flew across the controls, disabling the ship's tracking systems and locking down communications. As the alarms blared and the ship's systems faltered, Jake activated the cruiser's external speakers. His voice echoed across the vessel, cold and unrelenting. "This is Jake Sullivan. I'm taking your ship. If you want to live, stay out of my way." The message wasn't just for the crew, it was for Thrax. Jake knew the commander would hear it, and he wanted him to. He wanted him to understand the gravity of his mistake. Thrax, however, was not one to cower. The alien stormed onto the bridge minutes later, his expression a mask of fury. Jake stood at the center of the room, his weapon trained on the commander. "You're a resourceful human," Thrax snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "But this ends now." Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. The detonations he'd set in the engine room triggered in sequence, shaking the ship violently. The lights flickered, and the faint hum of the engines sputtered into silence. The bridge descended into chaos, crew members scrambling to stabilize the vessel. Thrax's glare remained fixed on Jake, his claws flexing as he prepared to strike. But Jake was already moving, his weapon lowered in favor of close-quarters combat. Their clash was brutal, a whirlwind of blows and counterattacks that left no room for hesitation. Thrax was strong, his alien physiology granting him speed and power beyond that of an ordinary human. But Jake wasn't ordinary. Every strike, every movement was calculated, his years of training honed to a razor's edge. The fight ended as quickly as it began. Thrax lay sprawled on the floor, his breath ragged as Jake stood over him. The human's expression was calm, his breathing steady despite the ferocity of the battle. "This isn't your ship anymore," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "It's mine." He turned to the console, his focus shifting as Thrax's growl of defiance faded into the background. The ship was crippled, its systems barely functional, but it would serve its purpose. Jake wasn't just escaping, he was sending a message. The Galactic Empire thought they understood humanity. They didn't. And Jake Sullivan was going to make sure they never forgot. The cruiser drifted in the cold expanse of space, its once pristine hull scarred by explosions. Emergency lights pulsed and steady, crimson flashes across the dim corridors, casting long shadows that danced over the fallen. The sound of distant, groaning metal underscored the chaos Jake Sullivan had wrought. He stood on the bridge, his hands steady on the control console, his eyes locked on the tactical display before him. The ship was crippled, but not yet defeated, and neither was its crew. Behind him, Commander Thrax stirred, his battered body dragging itself upright. The alien's pride was as fractured as his armor, his mandibles clicking faintly as he spat out blood. Jake didn't turn, though he knew the sound well enough to recognize the threat wasn't over. "You think this is victory, human?" Thrax rasped, his voice sharp despite his obvious pain. "This is a momentary triumph. Nothing more. Jake's voice was calm, almost dispassionate, as he replied. You're right. This isn't over. But it's a start. Thrax snarled, forcing himself to his feet. His claws flexed, his posture coiled like a spring, but Jake didn't move from the console. He continued his work, hands flying over the controls as he navigated through layers of encryption. The Imperial systems were intricate, but Jake was relentless. You could surrender, Jake said without looking up. Save yourself and your crew. But I'm guessing that's not really your style. Thrax lunged, a blur of motion despite his injuries. Jake anticipated the move, sidestepping at the last moment. The alien's momentum carried him into the console, and Jake countered with a brutal elbow to the side of his head. Thrax stumbled but didn't fall, his growl deepening as he turned to face his adversary. The fight reignited with a ferocity that belied their exhaustion. Thrax was stronger, his strikes heavy and unrelenting, but Jake's precision was unmatched. He ducked, parried, and countered with surgical efficiency, exploiting every weakness the alien exposed. A misstep by Thrax gave Jake the opening he needed. He drove a knee into the alien's abdomen, following it with a calculated strike to the side of his neck. Thrax collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his body refusing to respond to his will. Jake knelt beside him, his expression impassive. You're done, Jake said quietly. Your ship is mine. Your crew is mine. If you're smart, you'll live to see what comes next. Thrax's mandibles twitched in defiance, but his body betrayed him, slumping under its own weight. Jake didn't linger. He rose and returned to the console, his focus unshaken. The ship's distress signal had already been disabled, its location effectively masked from the Empire's prying eyes. But Jake needed more than an escape. He needed leverage. The cruiser's database was a treasure trove of intelligence. Tactical schematics, fleet deployments, even high-level communications between Imperial officials. It was all there, buried behind layers of encryption. Jake worked methodically, bypassing security protocols with a mix of Earth ingenuity and stolen codes. As the information began to flow onto the console, Jake's eyes narrowed. The data painted a grim picture. The Empire wasn't just expanding, it was preparing for total conquest, and Earth was in its sights. The outpost where he'd been captured had been part of a larger operation, a testing ground for advanced weaponry designed to crush resistance before it could even begin. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd known the Empire was a threat, but this was worse than he'd imagined. The scale of their plans, the sheer ruthlessness of their strategies. It was a level of cold, calculated destruction that left no room for negotiation. He activated the ship's communication array, rerouting its signal through encrypted relays to avoid detection. The message he sent was short but urgent, a warning to Earth's military command. He transmitted everything: the schematics, the fleet movements, the intercepted orders. It was a call to arms, a declaration that humanity would not go quietly into the void. The transmission ended, and for a moment, Jake allowed himself to breathe. The weight of the mission, the reality of what lay ahead, pressed heavily on him. But there was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. His training had prepared him for this, even if the stakes had never been so high. Behind him, Thrax stirred again, his voice weak but defiant. You think your people will survive this? You've only delayed the inevitable. Jake turned, his expression unreadable. He walked over to the fallen commander and crouched, his voice low but firm. You've underestimated us from the start. That's your real mistake. Thrax managed a faint, bitter laugh. One man can't change the fate of a species. Jake's gaze hardened, his green eyes piercing through the alien's bravado. One man doesn't have to. Sometimes, all it takes is a spark. He stood, leaving Thrax where he lay. The bridge was silent now, save for the faint hum of the systems Jake had brought back online. He looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, his mind already turning to the battles yet to come. The Empire thought Earth was weak, a backwater world ripe for domination. They thought its people were primitive, incapable of standing against the might of a galactic superpower. Jake Sullivan was going to prove them wrong. As he set the ship's coordinates, aiming for a rendezvous point far beyond the Empire's immediate reach, a faint smile crossed his face. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Jake wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for humanity's future. And he didn't intend to lose.